John Locke on Identity and Diversity. This is from chapter 27 of his An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. I am just going to read through this and pick out key ideas rather than record myself explaining and teaching to it. Again, just a proviso here. Just reading a PowerPoint is not great teaching. You can watch, pause, take notes. A lot of this you already have. I'm going to try and stop and unpack the key ideas. So we can do this very quickly. Locke in context, you can just read this. Locke belongs to an era known in modern philosophy. It's followed on from scholasticism. Again, do you need all this for exams? No, but it's really worthwhile understanding it. Scholastic philosophy took the Bible and Aristotle as authoritative. Modern philosophy takes reason as authority. So you've got Descartes, who you've looked at. You've got John Locke, who's an empiricist. You should know what that term means. And you've got David Hume, follows on from John Locke, who is an empiricist but also skeptical. There's a tendency to look at Locke and Hume. Apologies if you haven't had it presented to you or if you haven't seen this, but there is a tendency among some thinkers to sort of look at the empiricists and treat them as if this is almost synonymous with the word atheist, and it's far from correct. John Locke is not an atheist. He believes in God. David Hume is an atheist. Before Locke, we've got Rene Descartes, defines the self as an immaterial soul, and Thomas Hobbes defined the self in purely material terms. So there's the sort of contrast. Hobbes is not one of our thinkers that we are, how to put this, it's not that he's not one of our key thinkers. We're not expected to know him. We can't be asked a question about him on the exam. You probably would find that even if you did know him well, you're probably not going to mention him in your exam in great detail. But to understand who he was and what he was saying, just for the top end student, is going to give them that contextual background. Locke on identity. Locke is trying to explain identity, i.e. the criterion or criteria that distinguishes when a thing is one thing rather than another. Note, criteria plural, criterion singular. He talks about this in terms of sameness. Going back to that quick little note, criteria plural, criterion singular. Does that matter to examiners if you get that tiny little thing wrong? They're probably not going to mark you down for mixing those two up in an exam, particularly under exam pressure. However, knowing the correct term shows a precision of knowledge that the top end students have, and they always get that sort of thing right. So Locke talks about this in terms of sameness. I've mentioned that term earlier when in the short video about personal identity, an introduction to personal identity. We need to be careful that we understand how our thinkers are using this word same, and that we are clear how we are using it. It is entirely possible to write a response where you use the word same several different ways in what you've just written. So you need to be clear to your reader what, each time that you mention it, how you are using it. Same is different to similar. You can have two things that look similar, but they're not the same. Okay. Locke defines identity as when a thing is one thing rather than another. That's kind of the key quote. You should probably put that in an answer if you get asked about this in an exam. Locke aims to establish what can be known as the principle of individuation, POI. The examiners use this phrase and they are comfortable with it, and if you were to use it, POI, in an exam answer, it would be okay. The strong recommendation I'll give you is, if you're using abbreviations like that, make certain that the first time you write the full term out. So Locke aims to establish the principle of individuation, i.e. what distinguishes one thing from another. this is not the same as personal identity per se. So we can talk about what makes up one pencil the same as another pencil. So they might be both HB, for example. That means that they're both, or they might be both grey lead. So they're the same because they're both grey lead pencils, but obviously they're two different pencils. And then you've got this idea of personal identity, what makes you, you. And that's going to be really much more our focus once we get into this. Locke identifies three types of entities. Apologies. Substance, man, and person. Before I get into this, we're now actually starting to get into Locke's text. Locke is a pragmatic person. He is exploring what personal identity is, not because he likes to sit around thinking, oh, what's personal identity? It's because he wants to use this definition. He wants to be able to use it, particularly in things like a forensic use. Now, you'll hear the word forensic and you probably immediately think of TV shows where police capture someone and then the forensic scientists cut up the body. The forensic use is a legalistic use, okay? So you want to be able to say person X owns that car or owns something. So what makes person X person X? What makes that person continuously? How come they own the car on Monday, but they still own it on Friday? Or do they? If we say that identity resides in, so we take a sort of materialistic view, and we say that a person is simply material, well, the person on Monday, let's say the person on Monday has has an accident and they lose their arm. They're no longer the same material by the Friday. They're now a one-armed person. They were a two-armed person, now they're a one-armed person. So if we're taking identity, the criteria for or the criterion for identity as being materialism, then they no longer own that car. There is a legal consequence. There is a forensic consequence. And this is something that Locke is concerned with. So Locke sets out to try and identify this principle of individuation, this concept of personal identity. He starts out by trying to understand what are we talking about when we're talking about identity. And he says, well, he's a little bit like following the footsteps of Descartes here. He's quite rational in his thought, and he works through a process of exploring his thought and exploring the question. And he starts off and he says, look, there's three types of identities. There's substance, there's man, and there's person. So substance would be, I've got a table in front of me. It's made out of wood. That's the substance. There's man, the generic form. We could say that the generic form of this thing is a table. And then there is, but there are many tables. So what makes this table? This table. Now, if we take that to personhood, we could say that here I am, and I'm made out of flesh and blood. I am a man. That is the generic term. Male and female are gender terms. Man is a generic term. So, girls, you are men. You are man, generically. You are female, men. Okay? Or female man. I'm just pointing that out so we don't get caught up in sort of questions of political correctness about this. What we're concerned with as philosophy students at this stage is precision of language, and that's what the word man means. So you have substance, flesh and blood, man, that's the type I am, and you are, and you have person. So I am Dr. Scott, you are Fred, Jane, whoever the hell you are. Okay. Right, let's look at this table. I'll take you through this table so you understand what it's basically doing. Substance, the first one. This is based on identity being about material. In terms of personhood, it gives us a same body theory, i.e. that personhood resides in a person having the same physical material body. However, jump along. If someone loses a body part, we still talk about them as the same person. Jump along. Therefore, it is not the sameness of matter which determines personal identity. So that's the first thing he's going to look at. There is a little bit with Locke where he jumps around back and forward between these, but this is just trying to get you to see the three major areas that he looks at, even though he jumps back and forward a little bit with some of the examples and thought experiments he looks at. The second one is man, i.e. generic. We are man. We are generically human. So this is a same mind, same soul type of theory. He explores the idea of, is it the mind that makes us, or is it the soul that makes us? I don't want you to get confused with this word mind, because some of you might be thinking mind and you might be thinking brain and you might be thinking consciousness and you might be thinking memory, and they're really going to be held off. So really focus on this word soul, because actually that's what he looks at. He says a human is a human because they have a human soul. So he explores, is it the soul that makes us the person? And he explores this through several different examples and thought experiments. One of the key ones that you'll look at will be the Prince and the Cobbler thought experiment. Now, I've written thought experiment there, and I've referred to them as thought experiments, and I've referred to examples. They are different. A thought experiment is different to an example. And throughout what Locke gives us, he moves between thought experiments and examples. Thought experiments and examples work differently. This is why it's important to understand the difference. I'm going to give you another movie after this one, looking at Locke's thought experiments and examples and explaining them, and hopefully give you some more visuals so that you can remember them and see how they work. Very common exam questions to outline and explain his Prince and the Cobbler thought experiment. Or another one that turns up in exams is outline and explain one of Locke's examples for X or Y. Now, this is a tricky one because sometimes they ask you to outline an example, and many of the kids will go and outline one of the thought experiments and they will get 0. So the question might be only worth 2 or 3 marks, but every mark counts. If they ask you for a thought experiment and you give them an example, you'll get 0. If they ask you for an example and you give them a thought experiment, you get 0. They are testing your understanding of this. Okay? Right, let's get back to this table. Man, generic, human, same soul theory. Prince and the Cobbler thought experiment, single soul sharing 2 or more persons in reincarnation. Therefore, it is not the continuity. So you have a single soul sharing 2 or more persons. So it is not the continuity of life principle that determines personal identity. Self is not identical with soul. Now, I'm going through this really quickly, and it's really the sort of... I tend to do this with my students after we've read the text. I'm kind of assuming you've either read the text or that this helps you put the text into context and that you can control your reading. So I am going through this ridiculously fast, and I apologize if you don't quite get exactly what I mean at this stage. And finally, person, a thinking, intelligent being. Rational thinking, self-aware, that's the key, self-aware, conscious, that means. And this what makes us conscious, and this leads to what you might refer to as a mental connections theory. So we've got a same body theory, a same soul theory, and a mental connections theory. And we find our continuity of self through our memories. This is what Locke is going to argue. Hence, memory is the source of personal identity. That is our key. Self is that conscious thinking thing. Consciousness is the key to personal identity, and consciousness requires memory. So, Locke's idea of person. Locke sees the idea of person as displaying three basic qualities: rationality, the ability to think, and the being self-aware. Locke uses a series of thought experiments and examples to try and locate the criterion or criteria of personal identity. These test the three qualities of person to see which, if any, give a satisfactory explanation for identity. The first one he looks at is called the rational parrot. As I said, I've gone through all of these in another movie, so I will just skip through them here. The other movie is more aimed at trying to help you remember the different ones and identify them. Locke uses the example of a rational parrot to show that rationality does not equate with being a man. Some say this is a thought experiment when viewed in conjunction with the example of Heliogalibus. Okay, I'll admit I don't teach Greek. Heliogalibus. I'm certain all the students studying Greek can fix that up for me. Soul in the body of one of his pigs. It would be a thought experiment if it were a matter of conjecture, i.e., if you have a rational parrot, would we call it a man? If we know the soul of a man is in a pig, would we call it a man? However, Locke doesn't ask this. He simply states, in this example, we would not think this. So he says, if we have a rational parrot, we still wouldn't call it a man. Therefore, rationality can't be the criterion of man. Locke says, person stands for a thinking, intelligent being. So Peter Gibson, the secretary of the Oxford Philosophical Society, claims that Locke's rational parrot example leads to the conclusion that if a parrot holds rationality, self-aware conversations, it is a person, but not a man. Locke doesn't explicitly say this. He just uses this example to dismiss rationality as the criterion for man. Not for person, but for man. Okay, so his first step is just to say rationality doesn't make man. He gives the example of cutting off a hand. Locke then posits that personal identity resides in consciousness. He then goes backwards, so to speak. As I said, he goes backwards and forwards a few times to question the relationship of body to identity. He uses the example of cutting off a hand to show identity does not reside in substance. Okay, that's the next thing he does. Identity doesn't reside in substance. He then questions the nature of thinking. What is a thinking substance? He asks if consciousness, which is to say identity, can be transferred from one thinking substance to another. Okay, you can read that. He uses the example of the reincarnation of Nestor to show that identity does not reside in soul. So he kind of equates thinking and soul. But the key here, and I'll go back and read this sentence, it's in the third paragraph down. He recognizes that while the same soul may reside in two different bodies, if there is no memory, there is no identification between the bodies as being the same person. As such, I don't want to argue that don't want to say that he advocates or believes in reincarnation, but he's saying, if we had reincarnation and you had a soul that existed in Cleopatra and now exists in you, right? So you'd have the same soul in two different physical bodies. Does that make it the same person? And he says, well, no, if they don't remember each other. There has to be a continuity of memory. So it's not the soul that's doing the memory, it's the consciousness. He uses the example of the reincarnation of Nestor to show that identity does not reside in the soul. Okay. Locke now has dismissed material substance and immaterial substance. This is a nice way of looking at what a lot of the text basically says very quickly. Locke has now dismissed material substance, the body, and immaterial substance, the soul, and rationality and thinking as the criterion for principle of identity. He feels that the soul viewed as a continuity of consciousness does seem to provide an adequate criterion of identity. Given that Locke started by positing that identity resides in consciousness, Locke has been criticised as presenting a circular argument. And you're going to need to know criticisms of Locke and Hume and all your thinkers. Locke argues for a continuity of self which avoids reliance on any substance, either material or immaterial substance, i.e. spiritual soul. Locke develops a theory of psychological continuity, memory continuity. For Locke, continuity of psychological states is both necessary and sufficient for being the same person. This phrase, necessary and sufficient, really important phrase. You should take ownership if you don't quite get the difference between necessary and sufficient. Ask your teacher, make it one of the things that you say, I really want a strong grasp of what these two phrases mean or how these two phrases work together. So Locke's memory theory of personal identity. If X and Y are persons, then X equals Y if and only if X has memories of being Y or has memories of being X. Okay, the Prince and the Cobbler. Continuing his inquiry into the relationship of identity to consciousness, Locke presents the thought experiment of the Prince and Cobbler. He uses the thought experiment of the Prince and the Cobbler to show that from the point of view of everyone else, the Cobbler would remain the same man. However, from the point of view of the Prince, personhood resides in consciousness. And this raises the problem of other minds. When you read that, you should remember the problem of other minds, or you should have come across the problem of other minds. How can I know what someone else is thinking? When the Prince is transferred into the Cobbler, and just be careful here, it's not that the Prince goes into the Cobbler and the Cobbler goes into the Prince. It's just that the Prince goes into the Cobbler. That's all we need. That's all he needs for this thought experiment. So the Cobbler, who has the Prince's memories inside him, so the man Cobbler, the material flesh and blood, and the man, which is Cobbler. Does that make sense? Going back to substance and man, contains the person of the Prince. So it would remain the same man. However, from the point of view of the Prince, the personal identity resides in consciousness. The Prince still sees himself as the Prince. The trouble is here, the Prince might go looking like the Cobbler, not simply looking like the Cobbler, physically being the man Cobbler, goes out and says, hey, everyone, treat me like a prince. To which most people are going to say, well, why? You're a Cobbler. Why should we treat you like a prince? And I'll say, you've got to trust me, I am, in fact, the Prince. The problem here is the only person who can verify that is the Prince. So you've got to ask yourself, is there any reason why a Cobbler might have to lie about being a prince? And how would we verify that? There's the example of Noah's flood. Locke next asks what continuity of consciousness actually means. He notes that while the soul does not make the same man, yet consciousness, as far as it is extended, okay, this is about extension, even to past lives, provides a criterion for person. So while the soul in past lives, so in terms of reincarnation, so let's pretend that there was a soul, and let's pretend there is reincarnation, and that there is a soul, and I'm oversimplifying this idea of reincarnation here. There is a soul that goes into Cleopatra, and then it Cleopatra dies, and that soul goes out and it goes into someone else, and then it goes on and it travels along all these vessels until today, when it's now in you. Okay, even what Locke is saying here is, even if that is the case, it doesn't matter how many times this soul has done this, and through how much time this soul can be extended. If it isn't conscious, if the consciousness isn't extended beyond the life of an individual, then the soul does not provide a criterion for person. It is only the consciousness, insofar as it is extended, which provides the criterion for person. It's only if you can remember these past lives. He uses the example of having conscious remembering of Noah's flood, the overflowing of the Thames seen in the winter past, and his present writing, to show that the self who presently writing is the same self, personal identity, as the self that saw the Thames overflow and who saw Noah's flood. Notice there, when he says this, he's not trying to say, oh, I've been alive since Noah's flood. He is setting up, in this case, he is setting up an example to make his point. It's like, let's take an example. Let's pretend that let's say that I remember Noah's flood, and then I remember the Thames overflowing last year, and I remember myself writing in my book just 10 minutes ago. If I remember all of those, then that's what makes me I. That's what makes the person. This shows that consciousness does not rely on the same substance, material or immaterial, or the same man. You're going to feel like I'm repeating myself a bit here, and I am, because I'm going back over the text as it does. He then goes through the thought experiment of cutting off a finger. Locke uses the thought experiment of cutting off a finger. Yet imagining that consciousness went with the finger to show that it is consciousness that defines person, i.e. the finger would be the person. This is a thought experiment, because he says, let's imagine, let's do an experiment with our mind, our thought experiment, where we cut off a finger and yet the consciousness goes with the finger. Okay, so where would the person be? And his answer would be, it would be in the finger. It would be the finger. That's the person. The person would be the finger, because that's where the consciousness resides. Be really clear, this is different to earlier when he talked about cutting off a hand and saying, if we cut off a hand, the person doesn't change, so it can't be material that makes person. They're often compared, and they're tricky ones, and they get confused in exams all the time. So note, do not confuse this with the example of cutting off the hand. I really hope that the other movie I've made, which has stronger visuals, has visuals for all of this, I hope that those visuals will really drive into your head these examples and thought experiments. When you're doing all of this, you've got to be aware of the moral implications. The philosophy course is not just concerned about you knowing philosophers. It is really looking for you to use philosophers and to think philosophically, to do philosophy. And again, this is what Locke himself is doing here. He's not just concerned about thinking about personal identity as a purely philosophical exercise. He wants to do this so that he can use these concepts in a forensic way. Locke recognizes the implications of his conclusions by observing that it is in personal identity, continuity of consciousness, that all the right and justice of reward and punishment are found. He uses the example of punishing Socrates awake for what Socrates asleep has done. He says that this would be no more right and just than to punish one twin for what another twin had done. He recognizes objections about himself. And I should just go back, before I go further on, there's one thing I've missed in all of this. and that is, I mentioned earlier that Locke is religious, does have a belief in the afterlife and in God. So Locke's view of a continuity of consciousness requires, as I've spoken about earlier, requires an understanding of a sort of a continuity of time. From a religious point of view, God exists beyond time, so God sees all time simultaneously, which means God can see these identities as one, which also means that some of the moral implications, the moral questions, can be resolved by religious belief, in so much as this will be found out and identified in the afterlife. So I probably should have added that in here and explained it better. Be aware it's in the text. Find that section where he talks about the afterlife. Make certain you understand it. Locke's objections against himself. What about memory loss? What about a drunk person? These are great objections he raises against himself, and then he tries to answer them. So you're likely to get questions which says, well, what about this objection against Locke? And you can say, well, he recognized that objection, and this is how he responded to it. And then you're probably going to be asked, well, how convincing do you find his response? You should be aware of Joseph Butler, Thomas Reid, and Derek Parfit. They're the fallacy of circularity, the brave officer paradox, and the transporter thought experiment. Classic ones to use when evaluating and sort of analysing Locke.